July 11, 1943. Gela, Sicily. The tanks of the Hermann Göring Panzer Division are visible from the beach, not from the high ground behind the beach, not from the dunes or the low hills whose modest elevation provides the observer with the perspective that removes the threat from the immediate foreground, from the beach itself. Soldiers of the 1st Infantry Division who came ashore on this sand 24 hours ago are at the waterline and watching German armour move toward them across the flat coastal plain of the Gela plain, at a distance close enough to see the movement of the turrets, close enough to see the dust clouds that the advancing tracks are raising from the dry Sicilian earth, close enough to hear the engine noise carrying across the flat ground in the July morning air. There are approximately 60 German tanks in the 2 columns that General Paul Conrath has sent south toward the sea. Panzer IVs whose 75mm gun can destroy any American tank and engage the American artillery positions from ranges that the artillery's crew-served weapons cannot effectively return fire at. And Tigers, whose 88mm gun and whose 56-ton hull represent a weight of armor and a weight of firepower that the anti-tank weapons currently available to the 1st Infantry Division cannot penetrate from the front. The columns are advancing with the confidence of armored formations that have assessed the American defensive capability and found it, in its current state, on the morning of July 11, with the artillery not yet fully ashore and the defensive positions not yet consolidated, insufficiently capable of stopping them. The assessment is almost correct. The 1st Infantry Division's artillery is still being unloaded from the ships behind the soldiers on the beach. The anti-tank weapons that should be dug in on the plain, in front of the advancing armor, are in some cases still aboard the ships offshore, in the landing queue that the rough seas have delayed, and in other cases, in positions that the advancing armor has already overrun in the first hour of the attack. The Rangers of Colonel William Darby's 1st Ranger Battalion, who have been holding Gela town since the pre-dawn hours, before the main landing, are holding a position that the German armor can bypass without difficulty. The town's streets are obstacles to tank movement, and the German columns have been directed around the town, rather than through it. Between the Tiger tanks of the Hermann Göring Division and the water of the Mediterranean is approximately 800 yards of flat Sicilian coastal plain. If Conrath's armor reaches the water, the Allied invasion of Sicily, the largest amphibious operation in history to that point, is in serious danger of being driven back into the sea. This is the moment that every Allied planner feared and every German commander hoped for. The window between the landing and the consolidation, the hours when the amphibious force is on the beach, but has not yet built the defensive depth that would make an armored counterattack prohibitively costly. The moment when the entire calculus of the invasion is in the balance, and when the difference between success and catastrophe is the performance of a few thousand soldiers in a few square miles of flat Sicilian ground. It is happening, and the outcome is not yet determined. The Allied invasion of Sicily, Operation Husky, began on July 10, 1943, with 160,000 soldiers crossing the Mediterranean in 3,000 ships in the darkness of the early morning hours, landing simultaneously on the island's southern and southeastern coasts in the combined British-American amphibious operation that represents the most complex coordinated military action in history to that point. More complex than the North African landings in November 1942. More complex than the American sector was the southern coast, centered on the Gulf of Gela, a stretch of coastline whose wide sandy beaches and flat coastal plain made it well suited for amphibious landing, and whose relative proximity to the airfields at Ponte Olivo and Comiso made it a priority objective for the first day's operations. The American force landing on this coast consisted of Patton's 7th Army, with the 1st Infantry Division under Major General Terry Allen, landing at Gela itself in the center of the American sector, the 45th Infantry Division under Major General Troy Middleton, landing to the east at Scogliti, and the 3rd Infantry Division under Major General Lucian Truscott, landing to the west at Licata. The landings went in at 02:45 on July 10th in the face of seas that the summer mistral had been building for 2 days. Rough Mediterranean water that capsized landing craft and drove them off course, that scattered the airborne drops of the 82nd Airborne Division and the British 1st Airborne Division into the Sicilian countryside, in the disorganized dispersion that kills men in the dark, and that leaves the ground commanders without the forces whose arrival at specific objectives the operational plan has assumed. The rough seas scattered airborne drops, overturned landing craft that were never designed for the conditions they encountered, and disrupted the coordination between the infantry on the beach and the fire support offshore that the pre-invasion planning had assumed would be available from the first moments of the landing. By the morning of July 10th, the 1st Infantry Division was ashore in strength, but with its heavy weapons and much of its artillery still coming off the ships, its position on the coastal plain not yet consolidated, and the German and Italian forces on the island not yet fully committed to the counterattack that everyone on both sides knew was coming. The German force in Sicily, in July 1943, is organized around two primary mobile formations: the Hermann Göring Panzer Division, under General Paul Conrath, and the 15th Panzer Grenadier Division, whose motorized infantry and its supporting armor represent the other major German mobile reserve on the island. The Hermann Göring is named for Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, the Luftwaffe chief whose patronage has given the division its name, and whose ambitions for a Luftwaffe ground force capable of standing alongside the Wehrmacht's best formations have given it equipment and manpower allocations that a standard Luftwaffe formation would not otherwise possess. The division is equipped with Panzer IV medium tanks whose 75mm long-barreled gun is effective against all Allied armor in the theater, and according to the intelligence assessments that the Allied command has been compiling from prisoner interrogations and aerial reconnaissance photographs analyzed in the months before the landing, some Tiger I heavy tanks, the 56-ton Panzerkampfwagen 4 whose 88mm KWK-36 gun can destroy any Allied tank at ranges that the Allied anti-tank weapons cannot match, and whose frontal armor no American tank gun or infantry anti-tank weapon can penetrate. The Tiger's presence in the Hermann Göring Division's order of battle has been a known factor in the Allied planning for the Gela landing since the spring of 1943, when the first intelligence reports of Tiger deployment to Sicily began arriving at Eisenhower's planning staff, and it is one of the reasons that the 1st Infantry Division's specific and documented reputation for fighting in difficult circumstances, for performing in the conditions that less experienced divisions might break in, made it the assignment for the Gela Beach. The Gela Beach is the most dangerous of the American landing zones, the one whose geography places the landing force closest to the Hermann Göring Division's positions, the one where the counterattack will come first and hardest, because the terrain between the Hermann Göring's cantonment areas and the Gela shoreline is the flattest and most trafficable tank country on the American landing sector. General Terry Allen is the 1st Infantry Division's commander, the aggressive, unconventional, sometimes insubordinate but invariably effective commander whose relationship with Army orthodoxy is as complicated as his relationship with his adversary is simple. He fights the German army and he defeats it. Allen has a deputy whose personality and approach complement his own. Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt Jr., the eldest son of the 26th President, whose physical courage in leading from the front and whose specific and effective relationship with the soldiers he commands has been one of the 1st Division's operational assets since Tunisia. The 1st Infantry Division's soldiers call themselves the Big Red One for the shoulder patch that marks their division, and they have been in combat since North Africa in 1942, in the campaigns that have transformed the American Army's self-assessment from the post-Kesselring humility of February 1943 to the specific and earned confidence of soldiers who have learned to fight by fighting and who have been doing it long enough to be the most experienced American infantry unit in the theater. Conrath's plan for the counterattack is developed on July 10th, the day of the Allied landing, in the specific circumstances of a German commander who has been given a mission, destroy the Allied landing at Gela, and who has the tools to execute it if the execution begins at the right moment and proceeds with the speed and coordination that the plan requires. The plan is developed with the professional urgency of a commander who understands that the window of opportunity in an amphibious landing is measured in hours rather than in the days and weeks that ground operations normally allow for the accumulation of combat power and the preparation of the decisive stroke. That, the 24 to 48 hours immediately following the landing, are the hours when the attacking force is at its most vulnerable, when the heavy weapons are still at sea, when the defensive perimeter is still being established, when the communications between the various elements of the landing force are still being sorted out. After 48 hours, the consolidation begins. After 72 hours, the beachhead is a defensive position that armored counterattack cannot easily crack. Conrath must attack before the window closes, and the window is closing with every hour of July 10 that passes. The plan calls for a two-column attack southward toward the coast, the eastern column driving on Gela itself, attacking the 1st Infantry Division's positions on the coastal plain east of the town, whose flat and open character makes it the most suitable tank country in the American beachhead's immediate area. The western column driving toward the beach west of Gela, in the sector where the 3rd Infantry Division's eastern flank meets the 1st Infantry Division's western flank. The seam between two divisions, whose coordination has not yet reached the level that the 48 hours since landing would eventually produce. If both columns reach the coast simultaneously, the American beachhead is split at its most vulnerable point, and the landing's continuation is in doubt in the specific and immediately operational sense that split beachheads cannot be mutually supporting. The attack is scheduled to begin on the morning of July 11th, less than 36 hours after the American landing, and before the defensive consolidation that another 36 hours would produce has been completed. The timing is correct. Conrath has correctly identified the window of maximum American vulnerability and has correctly scheduled his attack to fall within it. The question is whether the attack's execution will be equal to the timing's correctness. The German plan requires the eastern and western columns to coordinate their advances so that the American defense is split between two simultaneous threats that cannot both be adequately covered. The coordination requires communication. The communication requires the radio infrastructure, whose maintenance in the field conditions of the Sicilian July is less than the plan's precision demands. And the execution of a two-column armored attack against a defended beachhead, in terrain that neither column commander has fully reconnoitered before the attack begins, is the kind of operation whose planning precision erodes in contact with the actual ground and the actual enemy. July 11th, 1943, 0600 hours. The Hermann Göring Panzer Division's eastern column moves south from the high ground north of Gela, in the specific and visceral spectacle of armored attack at first light on the Sicilian plain. 60 tanks and the accompanying motorized infantry of the Panzer Grenadier Regiment, whose presence with the armor gives the column both the penetration capability of the tanks and the infantry protection that armored formations need in close terrain. The dust rising from the dry Sicilian earth announces the column's approach before the visual contact that the 1st Infantry Division's observation posts make in the early morning light. Dust columns visible from miles away in the clear Mediterranean air. Columns whose direction and number tell the observers on the high ground above the beach that the counterattack they have been expecting since landing is arriving now, this morning, in the direction and at the scale that the intelligence assessments projected. The engine noise of the tank columns carries across the plain in the early morning air before the tanks are in range of the defenders. The 1st Infantry Division's observation posts transmit the contact reports that will begin the battle's decisive phase to Allen's command post, and Allen begins issuing the orders for the defensive response with the specific and focused urgency of a commander who has been preparing for this moment and who knows that the next hours will determine whether the beachhead holds. General Allen is at his forward command post when the reports arrive, at the specific and deliberately chosen position that Allen has established within range of the fighting, in the command style of a general who believes that the commander belongs at the point of the decision and that the point of the decision is at the front rather than in a rear area command post, whose distance from the fighting ensures that the information arriving there is already old by the time decisions based on it can be transmitted to the men who need them. Allen has been at his forward command post all night, since the darkness after the landing when the initial consolidation of the beachhead was still in progress, and when the reports of German and Italian counterattacks against the 1st Division's perimeter were arriving with enough frequency to keep the forward command post active through the night. He has been there because in Allen's understanding of command, the place where a general belongs is the place where the decision is being made, and the decision this morning is how to stop 60 German tanks with the artillery and the anti-tank weapons that have not yet been fully unloaded from the ships behind the beach. The near failure in the American defense, the moment when the counterattack comes closest to achieving the breakthrough that would split the beachhead and drive the 1st Infantry Division's soldiers back to the waterline, arrives at approximately GSO 900 on July 11th, when the Eastern Column's lead tanks reach a position on the Gela plain that the division's defensive preparation has not yet been fully established to cover. The 26th Infantry Regiment, under Colonel John Bowen, is in the path of the Eastern Column's advance, its soldiers in the fighting positions that the overnight consolidation has established, but whose anti-tank capability is limited by the absence of the heavy weapons that have not yet come ashore. The regiment's forward positions are overrun in the initial German advance, not destroyed in the sense of being killed to the last man, but pushed back by the weight of armor whose direct engagement the regiment's anti-tank weapons cannot meet effectively, at the ranges the advancing armor is using, whose 75mm guns outrange the American infantry's anti-tank capability, and whose armor the American weapons cannot penetrate from the front at combat ranges. The tanks continue south. The distance between the lead German tanks and the beach narrows from 2 miles to 1 mile to 800 yards, as the column continues its advance against the resistance that the 1st Infantry Division's forward elements are providing. Resistance that is real, that is being maintained by soldiers who are fighting with the specific and determined quality of men who understand that the water is behind them and that there is nowhere to go but forward. But that is insufficient to stop the armor, whose weight and whose gunpowder exceeds what the American infantry's current weapons can match. The German column's coordination with its own infantry, which the difficult terrain and the communications disruptions of combat have been eroding since the attack began, continues to degrade as the column advances. But the advance continues. At 800 yards from the beach, close enough for the German tank crews to see the landing craft still unloading at the shoreline, close enough for the soldiers on the beach to hear the tank engines without field glasses, close enough that the possibility of an armored column reaching the waterline is not a theoretical concern, but a physical reality whose prevention requires the exact resources that are being brought to bear at this exact moment. The counterattack's momentum encounters the specific and decisive response that American Combined Arms has been assembling since the first tank contact was reported. The 33rd Field Artillery Battalion, whose 105mm howitzers have been firing since before dawn in the fire support missions that the 1st Infantry Division's infantry has been requesting since the initial German contact was reported at 0600, shifts its fire to the direct anti-tank mission that the emergency requires. The mission of placing high explosive rounds in the path of the advancing armor at the rates and the accuracies that the battalion's forward observers, who have been tracking the German columns since first light, can direct. The 105mm howitzer is not an anti-tank weapon in the strict sense of a weapon designed for the direct engagement of armor, but at close ranges and with direct observation, it is capable of disabling and destroying the lighter German vehicles, and of creating the suppressive effect on the German infantry that prevents it from providing the close-in protection that the tank crews need against the anti-tank weapons that are being brought to bear on the column's flanks. The Rangers under Colonel William Darby, the 1st Ranger Battalion whose specific and documented operational record since North Africa has established them as the American Army's most capable assault infantry, soldiers who have been selected and trained for the exact kind of close combat in difficult circumstances that the situation on the Gela plain is producing this morning, have been holding Gela town through the night against the German and Italian forces that have been attempting to retake it since the landing. They move to positions on the coastal plain that allow their weapons to engage the advancing armor in the specific tactical manner of anti-armor infantry, the bazooka teams, that can find angles on the tank hulls that the frontal armor cannot protect, the rifle fire that forces the tank hatches closed and blinds the crew to the close-in threats, the concentrated small arms fire that kills the accompanying infantry and leaves the armor without the infantry protection that makes armored columns survivable in close terrain, and the naval gunfire, the factor whose specific and decisive contribution to the Gela defense has been the subject of every subsequent account of the battle, begins. The cruiser USS Boise and the cruiser USS Savannah, whose fire control systems have been tracking the German column from the moment the Naval Gunfire Liaison Officer, attached to the 1st Infantry Division, transmitted the first spot report, and whose gun crews have been standing by for exactly this fire mission since the first contact reports came in, at 0600. Open fire on the German armor at ranges that their 6-inch main batteries can reach with accuracy, and that the German armor's position on the flat coastal plain, flat ground with no terrain features that provide cover from plunging fire, leaves it exposed to without the defilade that would reduce the naval gunfire's effectiveness. The 6-inch shells of the Boise land among the German tank column, with the specific and physical impact of naval gunfire on armored vehicles. The shells land on the deck surfaces of the tanks whose armor is thinnest. They land among the tracks and running gear, whose exposed position below the hull provides the mechanical vulnerability that direct frontal penetration would not. A tank with destroyed tracks is as combat ineffective as a tank with a penetrated hull, and the naval gunfire is producing both. The shells kill the accompanying infantry whose presence with the armor has been providing the tank crews with the protection against close-in anti-tank attacks that unaccompanied armor has always been vulnerable to in close terrain, and the infantry's death leaves the armor alone in the open ground. The column stops. The leading tanks whose advance has brought them to the point where the water is visible beyond the beach vegetation, and where the landing craft still moving in the surf are visible from the tank commander's cupola, and where the physical possibility of driving the American soldiers off this beach and back into the sea is the most tangible and the most proximate it has been in the entire counterattack's 2-mile advance across the coastal plain. Stop under the fire that is coming from the naval guns behind them. The Boise's 6-inch shells landing among the armor, with the specific and devastating impact of naval-caliber ordnance on tanks whose armor was not designed to resist rounds of this scale, and the artillery in front of them, and the Rangers on their flanks, whose anti-tank weapons are finding the exposed flanks of the lead vehicles, whose attention is on the naval gunfire. The lead tanks begin to reverse. The column begins to pull back. The near miss that has been 36 hours in the making, that has been building since the moment the Hermann Göring Division's tactical plan for the counterattack was drawn up on July 10, and since the moment the American landing force came ashore with its artillery. Still offshore, has been averted by the margin of 800 yards and by the arrival of naval gunfire at the moment when the 1st Infantry Division's organic anti-tank resources were insufficient to stop the advance. 800 yards. The measurement that separates the invasion that succeeded from the invasion that almost failed. The measurement that is now being walked by the soldiers of the 1st Infantry Division, who are advancing across the ground the German armor has just vacated, moving north to re-establish the defensive perimeter that the counterattack displaced, carrying the specific and physical awareness that the water they landed through yesterday was 800 yards behind them when the German tanks stopped. By 1400 on July 11th, both of Conrath's columns have been stopped and are withdrawing to the high ground north of the coastal plain. The eastern column, which came closest to the beach and whose advance brought the German armor to within 800 yards of the waterline, has lost 26 tanks in the fighting on the coastal plain. Tanks destroyed or disabled by the combination of the 33rd Field Artillery Battalion's direct fire, the Rangers' close-in anti-tank weapons, and the naval gunfire from the Boise and the Savannah, whose contribution to the column's destruction, Conrath's own post-battle report, preserved in the German military records and later analyzed by the Allied historical staff, acknowledges as decisive. The western column, which had been advancing simultaneously against the junction of the 1st and 3rd Infantry Division sectors in the area west of Gela, has been stopped by a combination of 3rd Division artillery and additional naval gunfire from the USS Savannah, whose 6-inch guns found the western column's concentrations before it reached the penetration depth that the eastern column achieved. Both columns are withdrawing. The battle for the Gela beachhead is over. The counterattack has failed. The beachhead has been held, but the margin by which it has been held, 800 yards, approximately 30 minutes of additional armored advance at the pace the column was maintaining, before the naval gunfire stopped it. The difference between a naval gunfire liaison officer's spot report that got through on the first transmission and one that might have taken another 10 minutes to process through the communications chain is a margin that the participants on both sides will remember for the rest of their lives as the number that defines how close it was. The legacy of General Paul Conrath's counterattack at Gela on July 11, 1943, is a legacy that operates on several levels simultaneously, and whose full assessment requires looking at what actually happened, at what almost happened, and at what the distance between those two outcomes tells us about the specific and contingent character of military operations, whose outcomes are determined by the decisions and the performances of individual soldiers and individual officers in the specific and unrepeatable moments that history eventually compresses into the account of what happened. At the tactical level, the counterattack is a near success that becomes a failure. Near success because it penetrates deeper into the American beachhead than any subsequent German or Axis counterattack against an Allied amphibious landing will penetrate in the entire European campaign. Failure because the penetration stops 800 yards short of the water that it needed to reach to achieve the decisive outcome that would have changed the campaign and changed the war. The Hermann Göring Division loses 26 tanks on July 11th in the Gela fighting, and tank losses in the German order of battle in Sicily in July 1943 are losses that cannot be replaced from the available reserve because the reserve does not exist at the scale the replacement would require. Does not exist because the German military's tank production and the logistical pipeline that supplies armor to the Mediterranean theater has been designed for the Eastern Front's requirements, and because Sicily is a secondary theater whose resupply priority reflects that designation. The 26 tanks lost at Gela are 26 fewer tanks available for the defensive fighting that will follow, as Patton drives east toward Messina and Montgomery drives north along the eastern coast. And the fighting at Gela's cost to the Hermann Göring Division's armored strength is one of the specific and documented factors that makes the Sicilian campaign's subsequent American advance as rapid as it proves to be. A division with 26 fewer tanks is a less effective defensive instrument than a division with 26 more, and the difference is measurable in the miles of Sicilian road that the 1st and 3rd Infantry Divisions cover in August, without facing the concentrated armored resistance that a stronger Hermann Göring Division might have provided. At the operational level, the Gela counterattack is the most dangerous moment of the Allied Mediterranean campaign's 1943 phase, more dangerous than Salerno in September 1943, where the American beachhead at the Selle River is also threatened by German armored counterattack, but where the beachhead's depth and the defensive preparations' marginally more advanced state provide the buffer that the Gela beachhead at 0900 on July 11 does not have. The danger at Gela is the danger of an amphibious landing in its most vulnerable phase, the phase that every amphibious commander has understood since the Gallipoli campaign of 1915 as the critical vulnerability that the defender's counterattack must exploit if it is to succeed. When the attackers are on the beach but not yet consolidated, when the heavy weapons are not yet fully ashore, when the defensive perimeter is thin and the reserves that would reinforce it are in ships that cannot be unloaded fast enough to respond to an armored threat developing at the speed of Conrath's columns. The Gela counterattack reaches this vulnerability at its maximum and exploits it to its maximum. The Gela counterattack is the real test of whether the American army can survive the first hours of an amphibious assault against a competent and aggressive defender. The 1st Infantry Division passes the test. It passes it by the margin of 800 yards, and the decision of a naval gunfire liaison officer to call in the Boise's guns at the moment they were needed. At the strategic level, the Gela counterattack's failure is one of the events that makes the Allied victory in Sicily possible in the 38-day campaign, whose conclusion is the capture of Messina on August 17th. An Allied defeat at Gela on July 11th, a successful German armoured breakthrough to the beach, would not necessarily have ended the Sicilian campaign immediately, because the scale of the Allied invasion force and the depth of the Allied commitment made a complete reversal of the landing unlikely. But it would have delayed the consolidation of the beachhead, imposed additional casualties, potentially compromised the landing zone's operational utility, and given the German and Italian forces in Sicily the confidence and the operational time that the subsequent campaign's speed denied them. The 38-day campaign might have been a 60-day campaign or a 90-day campaign, with all the strategic consequences for the Italian mainland operations and the 1944 planning in both the Mediterranean and the cross-channel theatres that a longer Sicilian campaign would have produced. It was not. Conrath stopped 800 yards from the beach. The 1st Infantry Division held, and the counterattack that came within hours of changing the war's trajectory instead became the tactical episode that confirmed, for every subsequent Allied amphibious planning conference, that naval gunfire is not a supporting arm in an amphibious landing's first hours. It is the decisive arm, the arm that makes the difference between the beach held and the beach lost, between the beachhead consolidated and the beachhead driven into the sea. Every Allied planner who worked on Salerno and Anzio and Normandy knew Gela. They knew it because the 1st Infantry Division's soldiers told them about it in the after-action reviews and the operational analyses and the informal conversations between veterans whose direct experience of what armoured counterattack against an amphibious landing looks like from the receiving end is the most valuable operational intelligence that the Allied planning system possesses. They knew it because Gela is the data point that validates every subsequent decision to maintain offshore naval gunfire support for amphibious landings through the critical first 48 hours. The decision that the planners for Salerno make in September 1943, that the Anzio planners make in January 1944, that the Normandy planners make in their fire support planning for June 6, 1944. The 800 yards is the number that no one who was on that beach on July 11, 1943, ever forgot. The number that measures the distance between the invasion that succeeded and the invasion that almost failed, between the campaign that lasted 38 days and the campaign that might have lasted 3 times as long, between the Sicily that the Allies won in August 1943 and the Sicily that might have been contested until winter.